Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the panel on segregation, integration, and opportunity. We will be waiting a little bit for all the attendees to join, and then we will start. Okay, so hello again, and welcome to this panel on segregation, integration, and opportunity. So I welcome, so this is a panel that is moderated by Tanisha Sullivan. She is the president of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the Boston branch, and I will just turn it over to her now. Thank you.
Thank you, Alina, very much. And good afternoon, everyone. It is wonderful to be here. I want to begin by thanking Bari for assembling this conference yet again, not missing a beat during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think that's critically important because the issues that are discussed and addressed during the Bari conference are even, I would say, even more pressing now that we are in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. So it is good to be here. And again, thank you to the team at Bari for bringing us together today. This conversation, I am truly excited to be a part of: segregation, integration, and opportunity. We have assembled here just a very distinguished panel that is I'm looking forward to presenting their research in this space. I am going to introduce them just by name and affiliation, so you know who's here with us. We have Dr. Clemens Nolke from the Heller School for Public Policy at Brandeis, Jiang Yen Fan from MIT, Luisa Godmez-Putz, who's a PhD candidate at Boston University, and Carol Leone, who's a program manager from the City of Boston Mayor's Office for Immigrant Advancement. And we're hoping to be joined very shortly by Michael Johnson from UMass Boston. Again, looking forward to this conversation this afternoon. We are going to view a few video presentations from our panelists, and then we will transition into discussion.
My name is Clemens Nölke. The title of this work is Historical Government Redlining and Present-Day Child Opportunity: Evidence for the Boston Metro Area from a New National Data Set. These are my co-authors and our affiliations. The project is led by Dolores Acevedo Garcia, currently funded by the Robert Wood Johnson and W.K. Kellogg Foundations. In the Boston Metro Area, there are stark inequities in access to neighborhood opportunity. 6% of white, but nearly 60% of Black and Hispanic children live in a very low opportunity neighborhood. We see inequities like these in all large US metro areas, and a number of recent studies have emphasized the role housing policy has played, illustrating the toxic effects of structural racism on present-day racial ethnic inequalities. We focus here on the effects of neighborhood redlining by the Homeowner Loan Corporation, or HOLC. In the 1930s, the Great Depression brought devastation to many American households. In response, the federal government founded several entities that would massively intervene in the housing market. HOLC bought over 1 million struggling mortgages from lenders and refinanced them for better than market rates. Because lending and real estate markets were highly localized, and to better understand the assets it had acquired, HOLC undertook a city survey program. That's when redlining maps were drawn by local bank officers, city officials, and real estate professionals. The maps are accompanied by detailed area descriptions focusing on the quality of housing stock and socioeconomic composition of areas. Here's part of the map for the city of Boston. Based on their analysis, Hoag appraisers assigned a letter grade to areas summarizing credit risk, with A being the best colored green and D being the worst colored red. Practically all Black families lived in yellow or red-lined neighborhoods. This reflected both the fact that decades of exposure to racism and discrimination left Black families with few options besides living in poor, segregated neighborhoods with a low-quality housing stock that posed lending risks. It also reflects the racism of the appraisers and the appraisal process itself. The area descriptions reveal a strong racist, classist, and anti-immigrant animus, linking either the presence or proximity of specific groups to declining real estate values. Here's an example of clarifying remarks for a D-rated neighborhood in the South End. The appraiser notes that, and now I'm quoting the language from the 1930s, that area becomes less desirable north of Dover Street with Orientals concentrated in this spot. Portion west of Tremont is quite desirable, exception being Springfield Street, which is solid Negro. Essentially, this was the federal government saying that Black and other families are a threat to white wealth. By making racist evaluations part of appraisal and underwriting, Hoag thus normalized and took to scale racist practices that were prevalent in the real estate sector. Therefore, one important legacy of Hoag is helping to legitimize discrimination in housing policy for the following decades. Redlining also led to a disinvestment spiral, first reducing home values and credit access in redlined neighborhoods relative to others, thus reducing household wealth and investment, which further lowered access to credit relative to other neighborhoods. Redlining also increased segregation because white families in redlined neighborhoods could and did move to green-lined neighborhoods that weren't open to Black families due to discrimination, restrictive covenants, and housing costs. Housing inequities then spilled over into other sectors, including education and infrastructure, creating present-day inequities, with white neighborhoods and municipalities hoarding opportunities while keeping others out. Our own analysis show long-term effects of redlining on life expectancy and child opportunity, benefiting white families in particular. Here's what we did. We combined data on area Hoag rates from the University of Richmond with present-day census tract data on 3 outcomes, and we also merged in 1940 census data to control for pre-existing differences, noting that it is highly unlikely that Hoag maps affected 1940 data consequentially. We're left with about 9,000 tracts with both Hoag rating and 1940 census data. Our outcomes were life expectancy at birth in years, child opportunity index scores on a scale from 1 to 100, and the percentage of children who are non-Hispanic white. What I'll show you now is the regression coefficients of the census tract map Hoag rates for these outcomes. 2 model specifications, one without and one with 1940 controls. Each model run twice, once on the full sample and once on Boston Metro tracts only. We find that life expectancy is about 2 to 3 years higher in A or B rated areas compared to C or D rated areas. The gaps shrink after conditioning on 1940 census data, but remain significant nationally. The control effect for Boston is not significant, but it is also not significantly different from the national effect, meaning that the patterns we observe nationally also hold true here. The pattern is the same for COI 2.0 opportunity scores. More opportunity in A or B rated areas, the effect is smaller after conditioning, and again, the Boston effect is not significantly different from the national. Finally, here's the pattern for the percentage white children. White children are now more likely to reside in areas that were formerly A or B rated, an effect of 6 percentage points nationally, and this effect is larger in Boston. What we want to highlight is that the privileged position of white communities in the Boston metro area is in part due to racist practices in the housing sector that redistributed access to home loans towards affluent white communities. White families still enjoy the benefits. Their neighborhoods provide better opportunities in part because of what Hope did, while other communities continue to suffer from disinvestment and structural racism. To overcome this inequity, place-based investments are necessary in communities that have been hurt most by redlining and are still suffering from its consequences. Thank you.
This is Yuan from Hong Kong. I'm currently a research assistant at University of Hong Kong, Department of Geography. I'm also a research fellow at MIT Sensible City Lab. I was trained as a landscape architect, a planner, and also a researcher. It is a huge pleasure today to present this work, which is a joint effort among a group of very enthusiastic researchers trying to decipher the connection between the built environment and the level of social mixing in cities. Before I start today's presentation, I'd like you to answer a couple questions by looking at images. So first of all, have you ever noticed these changes in Boston? And then, do you think they are making a better city? Here are our images. So all pairs of images you saw in the previous slides were taken between 2016 to 2018. What we can see is that Boston has been constantly investing into making the city a more and more attractive place to live. It is known as one of the most livable cities in the US. However, on the other side, it is also cited as one of the most gentrified places. As cities constantly improve the built environment, it always attracts newcomers. In the meantime, are we able to maintain the level of diversity in the city? Is today's question we want to ask. Then how do we do this? How do we answer this question? First of all, let's break down these terms a little bit. Here we measure the level of social mixing from two perspectives. On one hand, we want to know that in the living neighborhood, in the census tract, how diverse are those residents? And on the other hand, since people also spend a lot of time in the urban public space in the cities, then how diverse are visitors on the streets? So at the neighborhood level, there have been already many different index researchers have proposed to measure inequality, social mixing, and segregation. Here today, we pick one of the simplest measures, the Shannon Diversity Index, to measure how diverse is each census tract given the income distribution of its residents. We use census five-year data to derive this index. Similarly, the experience diversity is measured income diversity, but based on who visits the same street segment in Boston. For example, person A visits the streets and probably go to a nice corner store. The GPS data from a smartphone will allow us to estimate when and where she has been in the place. Then another person may have visited the same street segment in the same time. These two people are considered to have a chance to meet each other. With millions of these GPS data, we will estimate how diverse is each street segment based on the time and where visitors visit. Here we visualize the visitors' diversity by different hours of the day in different neighborhoods in Boston. Obviously, the downtown area has a much higher diversity index among the selected neighborhoods, and also the diversity index have seen a peak in the noon compared to the morning. So lastly, how do we know if there is any urban changes in Boston? As you might have already guessed, our team collected millions of Google Street View images taken from different years with their geolocation data attached to each images. Then we used a deep learning algorithm, which was trained to understand human rating of built environments from millions of previously done human ratings. And we can give a score per image to estimate if there's any differences at the same location for each images. Here are more examples that using our algorithm, we could detect positive and negative changes in the cities. Placed in blue box are places with higher street scores in recent years compared to previous years, and they see more positive changes. The ones in the red are seeing more negative changes. With these parameters in place, we start to answer the previous research questions we raised. That is, what is the connection between the built environment and the diversity of the neighborhood and our public open space? First of all, let's look at the neighborhood level. What we observed is that places with initial very high street score actually tend to see more reduction in the residential diversity, which is here. Where on the contrary, places very low street score in 2009 actually see slightly increase in the residential diversity. However, this kind of increase in the residential diversity is more or less introduced by new development happening in the post-industrial side or dedicated opportunity zones such as East Boston. Then what about the public spaces? Here we show a map that illustrates the changes of experience diversity between year 2016 and year 2018. Blue lines indicates that the data captures much more increased experience diversity, while the red lines indicates there are less increase or even decline. We found that places with many landmarks and more green spaces or close to the transit station actually see more increased in experienced diversities. What is more interesting is we also find this kind of correlation between the two parameters actually varies from morning to night. What we can observe in this graph is street segments that see a lot of positive improvement actually see more increased diversity in the night, but less in the morning. Here is an example at Back Bay. The algorithm detected that there is a positive change in the urban environment in the place and a lot more diverse in the night, relatively less changes of diversity in the morning. And similar events actually happen in the West End neighborhood as well. We see there is a new construction finished, which introduced a lot more new diversity happening in the night, but less in the morning. So with all these findings in place, what do we want to conclude? First of all, I want to emphasize that we're definitely not establishing a causal relationship between the two. There's no evidence indicating that a place looks better and actually lead to more displacement or segregation. But is this more like a negotiation? Probably yes. We're hoping that the research measurements we develop in this research could help to support any conversation during the planning process that aiming at improving the overall living environment for Boston. But in the meantime, it also considers the importance of maintaining a diverse urban environment. Lastly, I want to introduce our team, which is composed of researchers from both Harvard and MIT. And thank you all today for listening.
Good morning. I'm Michael Johnson. With my UMass Boston graduate student colleagues, Patricio Beloy, Heather McLean, and Sajani Kandel, I'm happy to present this BARI conference talk on climate and housing crisis, a research agenda for vulnerable urban communities. In this talk, we'll describe a project supported by the Lincoln Institute on Land Policy and the Sustainable Solutions Lab at University of Massachusetts, Boston, to explore the impacts of the housing affordability crisis and the climate crisis, amplified by the COVID-19 pandemic, and policy and planning responses to this crisis. We found that there's no single body of research or municipal plans that address these crises in a systematic way. And therefore, we propose a research initiative that puts equity, a critical approach, and racial and social justice at the center. We want to develop policy and planning initiatives that protect vulnerable urban communities, support the development of affordable and opportunity-rich communities while addressing the short and long-term impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. In this presentation, we'll present findings from community-engaged problem structuring activities and present new research questions that can support transdisciplinary mixed methods inquiry. The connections between housing unaffordability, climate change impacts, and COVID-19 for low and moderate income communities and communities of color can be visualized in a dramatic way. Climate change, represented by extreme weather events, can result in health impacts such as psychological distress and allergies and asthma exacerbated by climate change, as well as lack of public spaces to cool down during heat events. These impacts can increase vulnerability to COVID-19 infection. In turn, the COVID-19 pandemic has resulted in extreme health impacts as well as job loss. This financial insecurity amplifies a variety of financial cost burdens, such as using air conditioning for heat relief, and introduces housing insecurity, which in turn amplifies the effects of the ongoing housing crisis. Moreover, housing market changes can increase the risk of displacement. Adaptation and mitigation efforts by property owners, as well as gentrification-related activities generally, can increase housing expenses and increase housing instability. This research project brings together knowledge from multiple disciplines: public policy, urban planning, environmental science, and decision and data science. Our project is a transdisciplinary endeavor. Transdisciplinarity addresses complex questions of broad social concern through the integration of multiple disciplines and the development of new models and methods where experiences and knowledge of non-experts is central to problem formulation and solution. Here, we present 4 disciplinary levels on the left-hand side of the slide. The first level brings together basic scientific knowledge from multiple disciplines. The second level engages applied fields that support development of policy instruments and planning interventions. The third level represents specific policies, plans, or laws demanding mitigation or adaptation actions to address climate change and affordable housing. The last level is where we specify our fundamental value of improving the well-being of vulnerable populations who are most affected by different impacts of the housing and climate crises, while not promoting more inequality and displacement. The research effort represented by the figure on the left has the potential to generate knowledge that can transform processes, organizations, and social outcomes, as seen on the right. The data for our project come from 3 sources. The first is interviews with scholars, housing developers, advocates, and funders between December 2019 and January 2021 to learn about specific initiatives to address the housing and climate crises. The second is a community town hall that took place in July 2020 to learn the stories of community residents in Boston who are facing the housing and climate crises in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. The third data source is a convening of academics, practitioners, funders, and advocates in August 2020 to learn how we frame and ask questions about the housing and climate crises, to learn how climate-focused policy instruments can address housing needs, and ways to align priorities of housing and climate advocates to put vulnerable communities at the center of politics and policy. We generated a number of key findings, including that low and moderate income residents feel intense distress living through the health pandemic and face severe and chronic financial, housing, and personal insecurity. We found a number of affordable and sustainable housing examples that have been developed in the Boston area, but it's not clear if these projects can be adapted to meet the needs of less advantaged communities. We found that authentic community engagement will require a mix of collaborations, analytic methods, and learning and technology, and there are unmet opportunities to influence climate policy so that housing stability for low and moderate income populations of color is at the center. We found a number of promising research questions that we'd like to describe. Our first addresses what neighborhood characteristics are supportive of interventions in vulnerable communities. The motivation for this question was our realization that there might be substantial barriers to replicating or adapting successful efforts for affordable and sustainable multifamily developments in affluent and politically influential communities to meet the needs and resources of less affluent and less politically influential communities in the greater Boston area. In particular, we wondered if there might be indicators of the communities of special interest to us that could indicate if and how affordable and sustainable housing and shelter-related infrastructure might be successfully built. This question is perhaps most central to our problem structuring project, as it reflects themes that occurred across all of our data gathering activities and reflects potential for robust academic findings and practitioner impact. The second research question arose from our awareness of the managerial, technical, and financial challenges associated with development of affordable and sustainable housing. We were struck by the notion that certain projects that might not be feasible according to the balance sheet reflect beneficial long-term and non-monetary impacts accruing to residents and communities. It seems to us that there might be an opportunity to adapt principles of social cost benefit analysis to assist developers, advocates, and government managers to develop a social policy rationale for projects that are innovative based on affordability and sustainability, especially in vulnerable communities. This research question brings together concerns related to fundamental values, quantifying important considerations of the housing and climate crises, and trade-offs between conflicting objectives. These concerns have tangible impacts for practitioners, both builders and funders, and advocates and public servants. The last research question arises from our realization that the problems that developers, planners, and community developers solve daily are technically quite demanding. They need to navigate policies, procedures, regulations, and best practices to decide how a certain project might be designed, sited, financed, and constructed. Since developments take a long time, it is possible that technologies in use now might be obsolete later, while other technologies not feasible at present might enter common use in a few years. Developers understand that different types of developments of different sizes, technologies, and affordability goals might be more appropriate for some communities and particular locations within communities than others. Therefore, there might be an opportunity to adapt principles and practices of the decision sciences to produce models and policies that would enable stakeholders to jointly identify, design, and solve problems associated with urban, affordable, and sustainable housing. To conclude, we have identified opportunities for applied, community-engaged transdisciplinary research to address how low and moderate income communities and communities of color can adapt best practices in sustainable and affordable housing, how technical methods for program evaluation can make the case for transformative investments, and how methods from data and decision sciences can build community capacity for planning and policy interventions. This research agenda can generate practitioner-focused knowledge, support research focused especially on vulnerable populations, and enhance teaching and university community partnerships. We'd like to acknowledge funding from the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, graduate assistantship funding from UMass Boston Sustainable Solutions Lab, research assistance from UMass Boston doctoral students, and the leadership of Sustainable Solutions Lab Director, Rebecca Hurst. My students and I thank you very much for your attention and look forward to questions that we can answer at a later point about this topic. Thank you very much.
So we are presenting the 2020-2021 cohort program evaluation of Immigrants Leave Boston. I'm Luisa Godinez-Puch, a PhD candidate at Boston University.
My name is Carol Leon. I am the Programs Manager at the Mayor's Office for Immigrant Advancement with the City of Boston. So just to start, I would love to tell you a little bit more about the office that created this program. So the Mayor's Office for Immigrant Advancement was created in 1998. We used to be known as the Office of New Bostonians, but now we're known as the Office for Immigrant Advancement, or MOIA. Our goal is to involve immigrants in Boston's civic, cultural, and social life, but we also want to make sure that immigrants have the same access to services that all residents enjoy, and we work hard to highlight the role of immigrants in the city of Boston. Next. So the purpose of the program Immigrants Leave Boston is to increase representation of immigrant communities in the civic life of the city of Boston, to increase the resources, knowledge, and relationships to the city of Boston of the participants of this program, and to create a cohort of ambassadors that will eventually help the city of Boston disseminate information about the work that they're doing, and also strengthen the engagement with immigrant communities. So just a little bit of an overview of the program. This is a multi-session course. We had a 12-week program with a welcome ceremony, 10 sessions, and a graduation ceremony. Everything was online because of COVID, and each session was an hour and a half on Wednesdays.
The first cohort consisted of 18 participants with quite a bit of diversity among them, slightly higher participation of females and renters. However, all participants spanned across 5 age groups, 9 different neighborhoods, 16 different countries of origin, and various education levels as well. Since the inception of ILB, Boston University partnered with the government of Boston to build an evaluation for the course. And this consisted of 2 main instruments, a pre-course evaluation and a post-course evaluation, both with open and closed-ended questions. We also participated in the sessions to observe the different interactions between public officials and participants. The main goal of this evaluation was to get at 4 main issues. First, to understand before and after the course the problem-solving knowledge and skills from participants, to know how civically engaged they were before the course and whether this changed throughout the extension of the course. We also wanted to measure how much participants trusted the city of Boston and whether that changed as well after the course. And finally, of course, we wanted to understand how efficient the course content and structure were. So let me present a few of our findings in each of these subjects. When it came to problem-solving knowledge and skills, we presented participants a series of questions with different scenarios in which they had to identify solutions involving the city of Boston for fixing these common problems. In the first part, we asked questions about housing, economic development, infrastructure, and we noticed that participants came with quite a bit of knowledge and knowledge of resources of the city of Boston. However, by the end of the course, the knowledge actually quite improved. And the answers from participants, again, on questions on education, housing insecurity, and food insecurity, were much more detailed, and they presented much more specific knowledge of resources from the city of Boston. When it came to civic engagement, before the course, most of the engagement that participants were having was at the neighborhood level. Very few of them had networked with public officials, attended public meetings, and most answered that they hadn't voted in the last election or that they were not eligible to vote. However, by the end of the course and throughout the course, all of the participants said to have, they said they had shared what they learned in the course with members of their communities. Many mentioned wanting to run for office. A lot of them also shared that they had used various government resources throughout the entirety of the course. However, we also identified still a reticence to participate in public meetings and to network with public officials, something that is important to look at in the next alteration of the course. When it came to trust in city government, we wanted to measure trust in various aspects, trust in terms of representation, in terms of education, in terms of infrastructure, and in terms of law enforcement. Before the course, trust was somewhat divided between participants. However, in all cases, with the exception of law enforcement, participants increased dramatically their levels of trust. And again, the next alteration of the course should try to look at why law enforcement wasn't there. And finally, when it came to course content and structure, participants were very pleased by the end of the course. Many strengths were mentioned, but the two main strengths mentioned by participants was the information provided in each session and the support and organization of Moya's team. The only particular and more apparent area of improvement that was identified by participants was to have a better time management in each of these sessions. Finally, I want to leave you with a quote from one of the participants who said, "I have shut down my voice other times. I have been in an environment where I had doubts on myself, but in this program, I was able to find that voice again and to feel empowered and to get that desire and fire in my heart to want to amplify my voice and tell my story to others." Please contact us if you're interested in getting the full report, and thank you so much for listening.
Wonderful. I'm going to invite all of our panelists back into the room. Clemens, Wynn, Michael, Luisa, and Carol, thank you so very much for sharing your work with us for this important panel discussion. I do want to give each of you an opportunity, if you're so inclined, to lift up any aspect of your research and work that you'd like to share at this time before we go into questions and answers. Luisa, Carol, I'll begin with you.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's really just such a pleasure to be here. I am not an academic, so this is definitely an interesting setting for me, but I'm still really excited, a little bit intimidated too. But just one thing that I definitely wanted to recognize, first of all, I had an amazing Rappaport fellow working with me on the project. Her name is Flo Glenn. And her and I were preparing to launch the program for a year before it actually launched, the pilot program last year. I also definitely wanted to recognize the fact that the city of Nashville and the city of Denver have created similar programs, and they're the ones that had the blueprint to create a civic academy. Especially here in Boston, they met with us, they shared with us the curriculum that they utilized for the program, and that's partly, well, it's a big reason why the program was able to be such a big success. But really, the reason why we wanted to do this is because we wanted to take the integration of immigrant communities to another level. And I think integration is also ensuring that unrepresented communities know how the city of Boston works. And we were very lucky also that we got a stipend. We got a budget for the program. And that's how we're able to also provide a stipend, which has not been done, at least not to my knowledge, in other cities. So happy to talk to anyone about the program, but I feel very lucky, and we have an amazing group of 18, and we hope in the future to have another group and even potentially have the program in other languages. So that's the only thing that I wanted to add. But 110 applicants, we got 18, and we hope to get a lot and many, many more applicants for the second round.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Wen, Michael, Clemens, would any of you like to expound upon your presentation at this time?
Yes, I can share that. So this project was intended to combine perspectives of practitioners, housing developers, of researchers and advocates and local residents. And I realized from this work that all of these stakeholders need to be at the table for a research project that can provide a meaningful response to the climate and housing crises. In particular, local residents, we understand much more how hard it is to do authentic community engagement, but we know that any solutions that we want to propose won't have meaning unless community residents are at the table and issues of equity and justice are at the center. And though many of us may be trained technically, it's the voices of community members that make our research real. So as we move forward on this research agenda, I'm looking forward to having a transdisciplinary team that can really make these impacts meaningful.
Thank you.
I can go next too.
Sure.
Yeah, so thank you for this hosting this event. It's really a pleasure here. Basically, before I joined my academia life, I actually was trained as a landscape architect. I also worked for a landscape architecture firm for a couple of years. So we're deeply aware that there are like certain good movement to make city better and more comfortable, but it also sometimes we also encounter this consequence that are unexpected, such as displacement and segregation happening at the same time. So this is why this research actually we're focusing on if the city keep changing, if the change of built environment actually has any connection with the segregation and the loss of diversity in city at all. And if there are residential segregation and the loss of residential diversity happening in the long term, can we kind of eliminate this kind of effect in the public open space by creating better places for people to meet each other during the daytime? So in the long term, we're also still working on collecting more survey data to identify the changes in the cities, as this is kind of the data that the city actually does not have to know where actually each individual smaller or large urban changes actually happen. So hopefully we can get a fuller data set and apply to the more cities in the US or other cities in the world as well, and see if there's any truths that hold for other places. Yep.
Thank you. Thank you. Clemens, anything to add?
Yes, just very briefly, I think, the main point we're trying to make with this research is that the whole redlining maps are a form of codified racism, that of racist ideas turned into maps that affected access to credit in a way that tended to enrich white and impoverish Black neighborhoods, and that's true nationally, and that's true also for the Boston metro area. It's a difficult thing. What do you do when the federal government, enacts a policy like this that still has consequences 8 years later?
Mhm.
At least it's a very difficult question. At least what we can do with this work is kind of identify the communities that have been hurt historically and that are still hurting, and that's maybe a starting point.
Thank you. I and appreciate all of the comments and reflection when I think about this particular topic, segregation, integration, and opportunity. For me, I actually, Clemens, I begin with something that you referenced, which is, how our communities across the United States were systematically segregated by design, by policy design. And your presentation about the Hulk and how that particular policy through advanced redlining. And, when we think about the impact of redlining, its impact on segregation, but also its impact as it relates to investment in communities. I was thinking about Michael and Wen's presentation and how it connects, how intentional we must be by design to increase integration and to create more inclusive communities to be able to undo the historic policies that were designed to keep us apart. Are there any, I know I'm speaking now to Michael, Wen, and Clemens. I know in each of your presentations, you lifted up examples of what we can do to increase inclusion and to increase integration. I'm going to get to the opportunity in a moment, but I want to sit here. Any of the recommendations that you want to lift up and specifically with those who are here, kind of share your thoughts on what we can do to help bring about greater integration in our communities?
Well, I'd like to share that our research project included a public event, town hall, where we had community residents along with local practitioners, and the level of distress and pain that residents felt living through a health pandemic and facing severe and chronic financial and housing and personal insecurity was just palpable. And we appreciate that kind of pain. And researchers, we don't always have that motivation and those problems to speak to. We also realize that if we're serious about engaging residents, then we need to change the language we use and connect with residents using not just a technical or technocratic language, but language that understands their distress. A third is that trained as an engineer, we tend to presume that that solutions to our problems can be implemented in a straightforward way, and not to look at community residents as experts in all stages of the process. I think that'll be essential for us. We heard all along that race needs to be central to our discussions, and that can be not just at the end point, but at the start.
That's good. Thank you. I wanted to greatly appreciate those comments. I think, really lifting up the power that comes when there is intentional community engagement, not just notification, informing, but engagement, and an appreciation that those living in communities, living in the neighborhoods, actually may have the solutions that we're seeking, oftentimes do have those solutions. And so when we think about the opportunity piece, right, on this continuum of segregation and integration to opportunity, Carol and Louisa, your work really does speak to one of the cornerstones of this experiment that we've got going on here called the United States. And that is civic engagement, participation in the government, in the process, so that people understand kind of that they belong in the process. We're not interlopers, right? And so can you talk a little bit more about your work helping the immigrant community better understand really the power that is in their voice and the power that they possess as community members?
Sure. I don't know. Do you want to do it, Carol, or should I go ahead?
So I can tell a little bit
Okay,
about
I'll just go ahead
for the program, and then I will turn it on to Lisa because she did the research on the actual impact the program had, right? Which I think that we can kind of like play off each other that way. So just so you have an idea of how the sessions took place, we basically had folks, we used what is called a popular education model. So participants discuss the topic before the session and before they actually talk to a city official. So I'll give you an example. Our first session was about housing, and we had Sheila Dillon, who's the commissioner, for the city of Boston for the Department of Neighborhood Development. And participants talked about the issues that they saw in housing in their communities. And then they did a report back to the city official in regards to what they were seeing around that and the issues that they were seeing, to give an opportunity to the city official to respond to some of these concerns. And then there was a Q&A. So I think there was also just like this idea of participants really do know what issues around housing are impacting their communities. So it's almost this idea of giving power to the people of, they are the ones that are living these experiences, right? Like they are the ones that are seeing how, if there's a housing crisis out there, it's impacting their communities. So I think that the goal for the program was really to give a voice to this group and also to connect them to these leaders so that in the future they would feel empowered to say, someone in my community is experiencing this issue, who do I reach out to? And then they feel empowered to say, I can reach out to this person. And they will reach out to on behalf of someone else, or they would pass on that information to someone from their community. So I think that one of the things that would be interesting, Luisa, if you can talk a little bit about really like the impact in numbers that the program had, because I can talk about it, right? Because I saw it, but I think numbers speak for themselves.
Sure, absolutely. I think I would also like to start by saying that beyond, the goodwill that the organizers of the program had when they designed this program, it was very intentionally designed with a lot of scientific rigor. So the partnership with us at Boston University really truly started even before the program was a reality, even before the budget was set, even before any, the sessions were designed. And so every single part of the program was designed with the idea of improving, the idea of creating a participatory sort of space, like Carol was mentioning. And it wasn't an idea of teaching immigrants. It was the idea of making this a two-way street, right? Participants sharing the issues that they were living, but also learning new leadership skills, as well as just knowing more about the resources at the city of Boston. So before the sessions of the course were created, we did a small survey with community leaders in various neighborhoods, for instance, of Boston, and we truly asked them, what are the most important topics that we need to discuss in these sessions, right? And what's the best structure to impact the participants? And based on those responses is that truly Carol and her team structured the course. And then even from the first session, we were truly thinking about evaluating the impact of the course. And as I mentioned in the presentation, we were mostly interested in 4 areas. We were very interested in knowing what level of knowledge and leadership skills participants had before the course and how the course improved or not that. We also wanted to know whether they were already civically engaged, whether they trusted city government, and of course, just know a little bit more about the content and the structure of the course, right? And I think there's two sides of this evaluation. Yes.
So I would just want to jump in here just really quickly, Louisa, because I'm watching the time, and I want to, because I'm mindful that, you know, what you and the work that you and Carol and the team have done, and also just reflecting back on what Michael just shared. What occurs to me as I'm listening is, so very often, and this ties to also what Clemens shared, so very often when we talk about, trying to advance racial equity, and address and tackle some of the systemic racism that exists in the US, where we look for new solutions, right? And we're not always, whether it's looking within a community, as Michael suggested, for solution, or it is replicating proven models of success, like it sounds like your program was a successful one in helping to increase the engagement of the immigrant community. Or we've got plenty of examples on the gender side of, programs and policies that have helped to increase gender diversity. It does make me wonder how programs like yours in particular could be replicated to help advance racial equity, within the Black, AAPI, and Latinx communities specifically. Do any of you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think one key aspect, at least that we experienced in our program, which by the way also had one session on equity, and we actually had very personal discussions on racism because we had a very diverse cohort of people. And I think truly the most important part of it was the participatory aspect of it. It's not about deciding what the solution is, it's about listening to the people and understanding what the troubles and struggles are that they are suffering. And I think if you ask me, that was one of the most successful parts of that program, because I saw the public officials truly listening to these communities and sort of like opening their eyes to perhaps issues that they hadn't heard from before.
Excellent. Any other thoughts? I'm watching the time, and I know that I can't believe we're quickly coming to an end here. But I want to make sure that, as we're closing out, that we're also we're looking forward, right? And talking about the solutions, right? So it is some of the things that I'm hearing. Again, I'm going to go back to square one. It's public policy got us here. Public policy and targeted programmatic interventions will get us out of this mess and really help to bring about greater inclusion and greater opportunity for all people. Also hearing and really do appreciate the intentionality of making sure that community voice is a part of any conversation to make change. And Michael, your note about ensuring that our language is accessible, right? Making it plain for folks so that any space we create is a space where people feel they belong and feel empowered to speak up and not feel intimidated by the space. Also keeping in mind, that if we are intentional about our design, if we are intentional about our policy, that in a very short period of time, we can see progress. And when your presentation really amplified that, that it is possible to see progress within our communities through public policy and intentional design within communities. And then the final piece that I know I will take from this conversation is, thinking about how we can replicate programs that work well to address inequity kind of broadly, and help and bring them to communities that could benefit from those programs, recognizing that if we have greater participation from all community members, which means that folks know how to participate, if we have greater civic engagement and participation in our democracy, then we will be able to more effectively tackle the issues of inequality. Those are my takeaways, just a few. I do want to thank you all for participating. Again, I want to remind attendees that all of these presentations are available. So I encourage you to go back and review them. And also I will encourage you to reach out to any of our esteemed panelists if you have further questions. There's nothing, there's nothing better, I'm sure, for a researcher to receive questions about their research and inquiry as people want to learn more about the work. It is very affirming. And so I know it would be welcomed if you were to do so. With that, I want to again thank Bari, and good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.